there's a reason why we are all connecting. And I think that's part of it. And I think that links back to my childhood, where there was a reason why we were coming together. We were coming together to change the ways we saw society. We were coming together to smash patriarchy. We were coming together to say women have a voice. We were coming, we were idealistic. We were young, but we were coming up against stuff. And I'm seeing that now in this amazing time where people are coming together and saying, no, we don't want to live in a fascist, authoritarian country. We don't want a king. We do want our rights. We do not want people just disappeared off the streets. American citizens disappeared. We don't want to see our elected officials arrested because they want to ask a question. We don't want to see. So to me, that's coming together, not to escape, but to join with a purpose in mind.
Welcome to Therapy for the World, an interview series with people working across the spectrum of self-care and world care. I'm Dan Sikorsky, a writing teacher and therapist, and the other voice you hear is Wendy Zheutlin, a college essay coach and tutor, former film producer and editor, published writer, and mom. We recorded this on June 27th, 2025 at 7:30 in the evening. Here's our conversation. One question that I have been wanting to start with for a while, and I'd love if this could be one of the first times we start with it, is about childhood. That can be a very formative time for many of us, either pulling us towards something or away from something. And I'm wondering if you can pinpoint experiences, events, people, maybe something in your childhood that shaped the person you are today.
I come from a large family. There was 5 kids, and I was the middle. And I was raised by 2 people who were narcissists and who loved the idea of having children but didn't know what to do with us, and did not know how to love us, and did not know how to give us basic things that people need. And that was super formative to me, because I had to look for mentors. I had to find other people to fill in the gaps. It also had, obviously, largely traumatic impact on me as well. But I think it's a lot of what has given me a sense of compassion and empathy and caring for others. And at a very early age, when I was about 9, I saw my younger sister, how my mom had just abandoned her. And so I took over. I became the tooth fairy. I made her birthday cakes. I cooked dinners for my younger brother and sister. I stepped in because somewhere intuitively I knew that little people need this kind of consistency and backbone and love unconditionally. And so I think that it took years for me I just did that. It took me years to ever put it all together, that's where some of my compassion comes from and empathy comes from. I also knew that I wanted to have a family, but I wanted to do it differently than my family of origin did it, and I wanted to be a different kind of person in the world than both my parents were. And that is not to say that they didn't give us issues. My mother was always taking us to anti-war demonstrations, and we belonged to a synagogue in which both rabbis were conscientious objectors during the war, and they would bring guest speakers who spoke about political issues. So I was exposed, and I went to a very progressive high school, so I was exposed to all these really wonderful ideas. So it wasn't black and white, and that was really another formative experience, is that life is really somewhere in the middle, in the grays, and that people are complicated. They're not all of one thing or another. That people can have this, my mother wasn't she was not a great mom, but there was all these other things I got from being her kid, this belief in social justice, this belief in being speaking my voice politically, in social activism, in you know, that's one of her legacies with me. My dad was an amazing swimmer, and I swim every single day of my life, and that was something I took from him. You know, he may not have been around very much, but I did get that, and that's a huge. He also, every Monday night we went to the library, and I'm an avid reader. You know, he'd put all five of us in the station wagon without seatbelts. We're flying around, and we go to the libraries and go. You know, and I learned the Dewey Decimal System on my own. I became a librarian, but I learned the Dewey Decimal System, and I knew where I wanted to go, and I figured out what books. And every day, every Monday, I'd come back with a stat. So there's things that, you know, nothing's all of one. Well, there are some things, but people are complicated. They're messy. And other thing that I think I learned, I don't know that I knew that as a kid, but as I've gained more perspective on it, I think it's one of the lessons I learned just being alive on this earth, but through my family, you know, that I didn't have those lovely warm laps to sit in, but I did gain things from my parents as well, and from my siblings. And now, you know, I'm closer with some of my siblings, but we all speak once a month together, you know, on Zooms. And so, you know, people are complicated.
I think
And
the
that
final
was,
scene that you shared with the being in the station wagon, all of you with your seatbelts unfastened, sort of, you know, bouncing around, but heading to the library is a great representation of all the parts of that childhood, right? Maybe the lack of care on the one hand, but hey, you were heading to the library, so
ex-
there's that at
right, the
least.
contradictions. Exactly. Yes, exactly.
You mentioned mentors earlier on. Can you point to someone who you sought out or who found you? I think that with mentors, it can be both ways, right? Sometimes one seeks them out, and other times the mentor is sort of
Yeah.
inspired to help the person. Can you point to
Okay.
someone earlier on?
Sure. One of them was my fifth grade teacher. He was this amazing guy who really got me interested in math. And I lived in Los Angeles, and we went to the beach all the time. We could ride our bikes to the beach. You know, we get on the beach, and his name was Spicarlo. It was an Italian name at any rate. And it was the summertime, and there was a gay beach in Santa Monica, and and I was with my closest friend Nancy, and we were walking, and there he was with his partner. And it was one of those moments of like, because I love this guy. He really excited me about learning. He was a kind man. And seeing him there, it was just one of those, like the sun broke out. And it was sort of like this wonderful moment and he was so kind, and he introduced us to his partner. And so he was a mentor in multiple ways. He was a mentor educationally, you know, teaching me the love of learning, teaching me about math, because in fifth grade you get a little more complicated math, and also teaching me about acceptance and inclusivity, and without ever using those words. There was also teachers were often mentors for me. There was also one of my Sunday school teachers at Temple who was into drama and poetry. And so he would come in, and we weren't just learning about forms of Judaism, we were learning also about drama and poetry. And he would recite things, and it was just, I felt so grown up, you know, hearing these poems, and that he took an interest in us as young people as if we were adults, you know, that we could think like adults. So often teachers were mentors to me. And probably later in life, like therapists were mentors to me, you know, therapists who helped me reparent myself, you know, helped me reparent what I didn't get in my childhood. And then I've had mentors in sort of my extended family, like a sister-in-law who lived in Seattle, and she and I would get on the phone and talk because she was up early as I was, and we would have these long, and she was a therapist, and we would have long conversations about books and life and therapy and all of that when I was going through, you know, my divorce and all of that. So she was another person who was a mentor to me. And so I've had, and I learned that mentoring, when you come from such a dysfunctional family, really is one of the routes out, is finding those other people to help you, and also see in yourself things that you may not, you know, when you come from a family like I came from, where there's so much criticism and judgment, and that gets internalized, and the self-doubt. Finding someone else who doesn't see that in you is sort of revelatory. It's like, really? You mean I'm not dumb? You mean I'm not, all the lines I had learned from my family, were shifted for me. And
That's
so
very
yeah,
beautiful.
teachers, therapy, those kinds of situations were really, and friends always, but less so. Friendship is something different. Friendship is less mentory than, certainly the other place where I found a mentor actually was when I was a filmmaker. There was a filmmaker whom I had met when I was working on a feature film, and he was a social issue documentarian. I had just finished graduate school in film, and we were both working on Never Cry Wolf when there was a big flood. And he went on to make the documentary, the Harvey Milk documentary about Harvey Milk, and I worked with him. And Rob was definitely a mentor to me in many ways, also because I was brought into this filmmaker community, the gay community in San Francisco, because he was sort of a big part of it. But more than that, and it included in dinners and conversations and in the editing rooms, but also in his vision. He has just such a lovely vision of the world. And he included all of us in the conversations about that. And then also as a filmmaker, I learned a lot. I was straight out of film school, and I learned a lot working with him and the group of people who worked on it. So he was definitely a mentor for me too. I'd forgotten about Rob. Yeah.
There was a part where you were describing how you are reparented by others. Often we are often reparented by others. I thought that was beautiful. It reminds me also of the concept of meeting others, right? Other people. Often when we're kids, like our parents are our first other. They are the first experience we have with someone who is not ourselves, and we often generalize from that experience. Like, okay, so I am regarded in X way by the outside world, and it's very difficult to break out of those ways of being seen. Early on, I from what I remember from our earlier conversations, you chose to live around many others in a pretty communal way.
I did.
How did that decision arise? Was that a typical thing to do at the time where you were? I'd love to hear about that.
So when I left home, I moved to Santa Cruz, which is sort of a hotbed of collectivism and social justice and political movements, which is why I moved there. And it was actually, when I was a teenager, I got really involved in the women's movement, and part of it through my older sister, part of it because I lived a block from UCLA, and there was all this amazing things happening on the campus, and I could just bicycle over there. And I learned early on, and I went to a very progressive school, high school, where we built geodesic domes in the desert as opposed to learning grammar. And so I had this. It was in my DNA to have interest in it, but the natural outgrowth was living outside of a nuclear family and creating an intentional community, whether it be a collective household, whether it be what I later did in life was the intentional community. And so I was drawn to the idea of collective households. I loved the idea. I loved the idea of a roommate being engaged in the idea of building a community within our own homes, and then the larger social community of building a bigger community within the city of Santa Cruz and working on local political issues, whether it be school board, mayor, whatever it was, zoning issues around the coast, whatever the issues were. I was involved in the anti-apartheid movement at UC Santa Cruz at the time. And so whatever that was, but also always having that family away from, creating one's own family, as it were, through these collective households. And I loved the collective household because the idea was we were breaking down barriers. We were all equally responsible for the household. We were all equally responsible for one another's feelings, as it were. We've had a lot of that processing going on in the living rooms. And it was, for me, a really important movement away from the nuclear family, which really had not been so healthy for me as a young person. And so these
Was that
collectives
often the case with the folks who lived there, that they came from nuclear
no,
families that, no?
Not really. No, I think it was a whole, I think for some people it was a financial decision. We like the bigger the house, the less money it costs to pay your rent. And we were living off, nothing. We were students. Um, but no, not that I remember that we talked about it. Because I also think we were young. We were like what, 18, 19. So we weren't really, we weren't far enough away from it to have that perspective on family. We didn't quite know what had hit us, a lot of us. It was kind of
But you
like,
lived there
well,
for a long time, right? Beyond those early
well,
years.
yeah, initially it was collectives in Santa Cruz, for a little break then just with one partner, my boyfriend down in Venice Beach, California. And then, we moved back to other ones. But then the intentional community that I built in San Francisco was something slightly different, based on the same concept of, we bought a building. There were 7 units in the building. We prorated them based on where they were because it was an Edwardian, so some were better than a little bit others. But the idea behind it was not only was it made it possible for those of us to start owning property, but also the idea of working together to form a community, of writers, filmmakers, nonprofit workers, librarians, people who shared politics and interests, and the idea of again creating a community that was separate. That community didn't have to be a partnership, just two people in a partnership. That we were broadening out what it meant. It didn't mean that people within the building weren't in partnership with others. Many of us were, but it was broadening it out. And even when that lasted for quite a long time, and even when I left that because I had gotten married and I was pregnant and we moved to Marin, we were looking to form another intentional community up here. The property was just too expensive. And I ended up in a very nuclear family situation, but always with community through other things, whether it was through preschool, whether it was through, people I'd met through my son's activities or through my then husband's, he was a school teacher, through, people like that. So always with the idea of community in mind.
What did that look like, for instance, when it was still living with a nuclear family, and when you came into those communities, was there already an intentional, or maybe if it's not nuclear, it's broader? I think you used extended community. Was that already existing, and you all inserted yourself into it? Did it take some active work on y'all's part?
No, we created it. The one that we did in San Francisco, we created.
I meant that later, when you guys lived more in like a nuclear family, right?
When we were looking to find one, we had met a few people. We met someone with a little boy Zach's age, who was they were 6 months at the time. And we started talking about where we had come from, and they turned out to be like-minded political. I don't remember how we met them. And they said, oh, well, we're a part of a group that's thinking about buying property and building. And I was like, we are in. And so we went for months looking at properties and meeting people and having meetings and thinking about it. The reason it never came about was property in Marin is just too expensive, and there were zoning issues around that. It would change today because people are now into infilling, but in those days there was a lot of density. People did not want high density housing, and that would have been high density housing because there would have been multiple houses with a common house on one piece of land, and we would have had to fight some of the other biases that exist in Marin County. But it was it was always on my mind. And then I started getting interested in the history of intentional communities, which have been around forever. People in, the Alcott father was, and Thoreau, and who's the other one, who wrote, not Walden, yeah. Who am I thinking of? But they were all
Whitman?
a part of an intentional, yes, they were all part of trying to create an intentional vegetarian intentional community up in the area, up in the Northeast there. And they believed in it. There have been many intentional communities through America's history. So I started looking into it and looking into the history of it. It's fascinating to me because to me, it makes so much sense. Where you pool resources, you pool emotional resources, you pool financial resources, you have the privacy of your own space with the loveliness of a collective space, the ability to come together for meals, for conversations, as well as the ability to have that, I need time to read my book, or I need time to, whatever. But it is something that, and I've looked at, yeah, I know in England they have intentional communities for older people, primarily older women, because women often outlive men. And, watching these women in their 70s and 80s who are just giddy with loving living in these situations where they have their own space, but they come together, they provide companionship, they provide all kinds of things that come from community. And I think it's one of the problems with I don't know if it's just American, but the model of the nuclear family is that it limits our exposure to other people, other adults. Now, having said that, there are many missteps in the 70s and the 60s and 70s with collectives where kids were left to run wild on the streets of the Haight-Ashbury. And these poor kids have grown up without direction, looking for, desperate. And I've seen many of those stories as well. And so I don't mean to idealize it or make it sound utopian. It has to be thoughtful, and it's not just an opportunity to renege on one's responsibilities if you're a parent, or to renege on responsibilities as a partner. Although in my youth, I sort of was briefly thinking, oh, smash monogamy. I'm not a non-monogamous person, it turns out, not me. And I find it to be really potentially dangerous to people's emotions, in terms of the ideology works, but then the practicality doesn't, and that, so when I think about intentional communities, I think they take a lot of care, and that it's like a garden, otherwise those weeds, the invasive plants will take over. And so, yes, there are many experiments that really didn't work. And certainly I am not a fan of cults or those kinds of things at all. Because that feels to me like lost people looking for a place. This is something different to me.
If it's not lost people looking for a place, what other tagline would we use for it?
I think it's coming together to build, the communities are really based upon that they strengthen everybody through everybody's strength, as opposed to a person, following a person, because cults follow a person. This is really, equal people coming together, sharing their skills, their interests, their emotional intelligence, their whatever it is. It just, in much the same way, like when you have a good friend, that there's so much we gain from that friendship. Like they may have a different perspective on the world, or they may bring a book to the next walk and say, God, you got to read this. Or they may tell you about this amazing dish they made last night, the way that we do. So it's just sort of a slightly bigger, but with the same care and kindness that goes into nurturing friendships or partnerships or parent-children relationships, just on a slightly bigger level. But it takes the same kind of work. Otherwise, they don't work.
You spoke about the history of these communities, which I imagine must be fascinating. And it makes sense to me that they have existed forever. I wonder what the current, what the actuality of these communities is. I hear often, folks maybe in my generation speak about wanting to join such communities, and I certainly see some examples here and there. But maybe I don't know enough examples. Maybe I'm a pessimist. Maybe I haven't, found them yet. But it seems to me like there's a bit of a scarcity of that type of living these days. I don't know if you're aware of the state of things right now. And I wonder what factors, if it's true that there is a scarcity, what factors lead to that? And certainly those factors, if they are there, were there in, so many years ago when you were trying to form these communities. I wonder what's changed now.
Oh, I would agree with you. I'm not aware of too many of these now. And I think that society's changed a lot. I mean, when I grew up in a time where there was a sense of hope. And I think that there was a sense of our voice mattering, like the anti-war movement, the anti-Vietnam War movement made a difference. I was quite young then, but I later in life saw it. Watergate was like, I was still young when that happened, but I understood that it made a difference, that people could speak out and make a difference. And I don't think that we live in an atomized society right now. People are isolated. I think that we don't have much civil discourse right now. I think that there is a lot, the old American mythos has really pronounced itself of the individual against society. You know, when you do the five conflicts, individual against society, we are in that right now. And I think that we live in a time where, because there's a feeling of scarcity, whether it's, you know, white men feeling like they're going to get booted out of this, you know, the replacement theory crap that's going on, or whether it's, you know, wanting to, you know, there's the tenor. I mean, one, we're a very divided society, but there is a very loud voice. I don't know that it's popular, but there is a loud voice that wants to take away people's rights, that wants to really, I mean, to an extreme extent. It's shocking to me. And American individualism is just on the rise. The misogyny, the xenophobia, the racism is just intense. And so I don't think that we're living in a time where people are feeling, there's a fear. It also establishes a lot of fear. I mean, when you see this amazing young man who wins the New York primary, who's just incredible, and people within the Democratic Party distancing themselves from him for fear of being called a socialist or being, it just makes me so sad, because that to me is fear based upon a fear of losing power or a fear of trying something new. I lived in a time when we experimented, we tried things, and I don't see that. That isn't around now. There isn't a sense of experimentation or trying things or testing the boundaries. We also, you know, I also grew up in a time where it was pre-Roe v. Wade, and then when that happened, it was this unbelievable liberation. And then now, in my lifetime, it being taken away and women's bodily autonomy being taken away, that to me, it feels like there's a clamping down. And so that doesn't, I think it's social and political and contextual why people aren't feeling safe to, you know, pool their resources and come together. Because I don't think that we're not building trust societally. And so I think that that's part of it, to me, why. And yeah, I think that's part of it. I mean, I think that you'll see pockets of it, like you'll see it more like in neighborhoods where there's community gardens, and that's lovely, you know, where people will come together around a community garden, or you know, like clearly in your coaching, college essay coaching, you'll hear of kids who are doing community-based projects, you know, and that's lovely. You know, it has that sense of hope. It has that sense of reaching out and building in spite of, you know, the concrete being poured on the garden, you know, or the weeds taking over. There's still little weeds popping up, you know, between the cracks. And, you know, I do believe that it's part of the human spirit, and I think it's going to rekindle. I just think right now is a really hard time. You know, we're really fighting just to keep our head above water a little bit right now.
I fight with myself sometimes around this concept of small isolated communities of do-gooders and of folks who want to get together and create alternatives. I'm speaking perhaps primarily of the modern variant of those types of communities. I think that you're right in that there is something substantially different in the ethos of those communities back then versus now. I fight with myself because I can't finish deciding if they are escapist, these communities, or if they are offering alternatives in the night, you know, stars in the night. I don't know the answer to that. I think there's a bit of both. I think that when they do isolate themselves and to put it bluntly, not give a damn about the outside world, then and not pretend to expend their energy, their vibe out into the world around, then maybe they become a problem, but not when they do hope to extend that outwards.
Yeah, and you know, one of the places I'm seeing it happen a little bit, it's not like building community, but I see it in the amazing protests that are happening right now in the United States. You know, the No Kings one, I was debating which one do I go to. There's this beautiful one in San Francisco where they build those human banners on the beach, you know, that get worldwide attention. And I thought, oh, I want to be a part of that. But they were having a local one literally I can walk to it. And I thought, I'm taking the dog, I'm walking to it. And it was lovely because I saw old neighbors, I saw friends, I met a woman I'd never known, and we're exchanging book ideas over the thing. And, you know, whether or not she becomes a friend, I don't know. But it made me feel like I could feel a part of my community, as opposed to feeling like, and it made it, all of those every day make a difference. And so, and those to me are not escapist, because we are addressing the issues we're seeing in the world. And it is really hopeful to me to see not just the like hands off or no kinks, but to see every single day people are out in their communities protesting, whether it's protesting ICE, a particular incident in their community, whether it's, they're still doing it, but the Tesla protest, and people are really clever and smart. I mean, some of their signs are just lovely and funny. And I feel more connected when I go to those, than if I'm just at home writing postcards or, calling. I mean, I do all of it, but I feel more connected when I'm with people in the streets, peacefully. And that gives me a sense of hope, because I also feel like that's the only way, especially after the Supreme Court today ruled, the executive has we're living in not just a monarchy anymore. But that gives me hope. And I don't feel like they're escapists. I feel like because there's a reason why we are all connecting. And I think that's part of it. And I think that links back to my childhood, where there was a reason why we were coming together. We were coming together to change the ways we saw society. We were coming together to smash patriarchy. We were coming together to say women have a voice. We were coming, we were idealistic. We were young, but we were coming up against stuff. And I'm seeing that now in this amazing time where people are coming together and saying, no, we don't want to live in a fascist, authoritarian country. We don't want a king. We do want our rights. We do not want people just disappeared off the streets. American citizens disappeared. We don't want to see our elected officials arrested because they want to ask a question. We don't want to see. So to me, that's coming together, not to escape, but to join with a purpose in mind. And then out of that will probably blossom friendships and things that come from it, because it's they're like-minded as well. Not that one always has to surround oneself around like-minded people, but typically we tend to, why we're drawn to the work we do tends to be, or why we're drawn to CEGs, they're like-minded in their approach. As opposed to, I've talked to other people who do the same work we do, and they say, I work for an organization that's just all about profit. They don't give us any, professional development or whatever. And, it's like, yeah, I wouldn't want to do that. No
Totally.
Thanks.
Totally.
So, yeah.
I think that there's an inkling in what you're sharing of a belief that I've found a lot of solace in. The belief is that, on the one hand, harboring a certain hopelessness around things actually changing. And I've heard this from climate activists. I've heard this from folks who have been waging the fight for their whole lives and now express a certain hopelessness around things ever changing in this lifetime. But that's not the reason why they fight, why they work. The reason is because they can't imagine not doing so, right? They can't imagine living this life without a sort of intention or forward direction where championing causes is part of that daily life, and where meeting folks who champion those causes is part of their daily life too. You've been alluding to the work we do, and I would love to talk about that with you. You talked about being in the film industry. I know that was a big first part of your career. How did you get there? Why did you leave? And how did you get into personal essay coaching?
Interesting. Okay, so I started out actually getting my PhD in psychology at the new school, I guess it was. It was an alternative school. It wasn't a four-year institution. And I did about a year of it. And I was drawn to psychology because of my own childhood trauma, and I thought this was going to be something. And I did a year of it. And I was like, nope, this is not for me. I don't want to spend my time thinking about this. And so my then partner and I moved up to Berkeley. He was doing journalism, and I was going to go to, I wasn't sure, I was doing photography at the time. And I realized I really wanted to be able to tell stories. I was taking pictures that were trying to tell stories, but I wanted to do it. So I had heard about the program at Stanford that did social issue documentaries, a tiny program. There was 9 of us in the class, and it was in the old days when they were just in Quonset huts. And that the teacher was from the Canadian Film Board, and that they have this amazing standard of filmmaking. And I had met these people who then ended up in that building that we all bought together. And I applied. I didn't even think twice about it. It didn't even occur to me, I did just none of that. But it was, I wanted to do this program. And talk about mentors. He was one of my mentors because he was one of the gentlest men that I'd ever met. And he was very reserved, and he would have these statements, like he'd look at our films and he would sit there for a moment, and you're sitting there like what's he going to say? What's he gonna... And he would say, "You have a very interesting way of using your music." Or like I used a lot of music from the 30s, and he loved that, and he would say, "You have very interesting taste in music." When, he was very reserved. It wasn't like Steven Spielberg. He wasn't going. I had taken courses at UCLA, and I had gone to UCLA and taken summer courses in filmmaking, and that was fine. It's state of the art, but it wasn't, there was no content there. It was just the craft. And Stanford was social issue documentary filmmaking. That was
What was
we
a
were
social
learning
issue documentary? What fell
So
into that category?
we actually just learned the basics, and in those days it was all analog. We were literally taping film together. We weren't doing things on computers or anything. But then there was an encouragement to talk about social issues in your thesis film, that it could be anything. But even in my third quarter one, I did something on the need for childcare. I did a whole thing on childcare and how childcare workers are underfunded and underpaid, and the childcare in general, and that we need universal childcare and stuff. This was when I was 30. I was, but it was an issue that mattered to me. I didn't have kids yet, and so the idea behind it was that when you make a film, it's not just about pyrotechnics or craft. It was, our teacher would always say to us, it's a poor craftsman blames their tools. The idea being that the content is what matters. And so they really told us that the storytelling is what matters, and learning how to tell a story. The other part comes along with it, but it wasn't an emphasis on how the lighting is or how it was really the storytelling.
What did you learn about storytelling in those days? What were some of the lessons that you were taught?
Good question. So one of the things I learned is I like personal stories that fit into a larger social narrative. And so for me, it was never the big social narrative. It was always the story that exemplified or illuminated the story. So my thesis film, nobody was talking about eating disorders back then. And what was being talked about was absolutely not true. And so I made a film on anorexia nervosa, but I did it all through the people I interviewed stories. I found 6 people, and they were all people that were outside the demographic of the conventional knowledge. And it wasn't at all from the expert's perspective. It was from their perspective, their experience, how they found, with a little bits of narration. Actually, Paula Poundstone, who's a famous comedian now, narrated it because I loved her in those days. And so that was my thesis film. And
the name itself of that film has the energy that you're describing. It's called Portraits of Anorexia, right? It's
Portraits of Anorexia.
Not the science of anorexia or
the
study of it. It's portraits.
Yep. Portraits. So you must have looked me up on Google or something. And my film company, intentionally, was titled Fat Chance Films. So, I did that. But then through that, I met Rob Epstein, I worked on Never Cry Wolf with him, which was this feature film. And then he was going to start this Harvey Milk film. And so I worked with him on that. And then I worked with him on the AIDS quilt film. And so these were films, and again, told through the people who had been impacted. So I learned a lot working with Rob, and also working with, he's now a well-known musician. His name is Mark Isham, but I worked with him on Never Cry Wolf, and he also scored my film, but he also scored Rob's film, and he's gone on to score a lot. But I learned a lot of the impact of music to the storytelling as well, the elements of storytelling. And then after that, I worked on a bunch of different documentaries, but I also worked in television, and I worked at KQED, which is our public broadcasting station here, for years on a series. And this was, again, years ago, long before the environmental movement, and it was called Green Means. And we we did 3 seasons in which we profiled ordinary people doing extraordinary things for the environment. And again, it was their stories that talked about a bigger issue. So we spoke with a woman in the middle of California who had figured out how to grow organic colored cotton, because cotton is one of the most heavily pesticided industries. And she had figured out how to cross germinate. And she literally, there would be green bowls of cotton and brown bowls of cotton that she had figured out how to, she was a scientist. And like we did a story about her. She was an amazing woman, you know, or people who were doing, well, the seed bank, of course. But, you know, we were doing individuals, again, based on the person's story that then talked about a bigger issue. So that was my introduction into the storytelling, that people want to hear stories and they're interested in character. We all are interested in how a character drives a story, but what makes them come to a story, as opposed to, we could talk about pesticide use in agriculture, but, you know, I mean, and reasons why Rachel Carson was so influential, because if you go back and read her writing, the woman who wrote Silent Spring, who's the birth of the environmental movement, her writing is unbelievable because it's personal stories of farmers who are fighting pesticides, or the impact the pesticides were having on the birds, or the impact. So it's like through personal stories, we learn bigger issues. And so that was really my orientation through filmmaking. And I then segue, you know, I did filmmaking for years. And I worked on some Hollywood movies too, but usually in a like low level thing, just because it made money. You made a lot of money doing that. But the KQED stuff, and I worked on a lot of different things at KQED, but Green Means was the one, of course, I was most proud of. And we produced a book out of that.
Your heart was in personal stories.
Yes. And personal stories that told political stories simultaneously, you know, that illuminated a political story. So not just some kooky character, you know, like my stories always were connected to some pressing social political story, or, and I learned a lot of that working on the Harvey Milk film, working on the quilt, the AIDS quilt film, you know, because that is, by itself, you know, the quilt with all the different people's lives that it was memorializing. And that, so I learned the value of the personal story to illuminate larger social political issues. And I did that until I had Zach, until I had my son. And it was too hard to do filmmaking and be a parent. And then my own personal health issues, which I'm happy to talk about. But I became a librarian after that. I didn't go to library school, but I worked in school libraries and I worked in the local public library. Because I love books. I mean, I am somebody that, I mean, I really, all my life have loved to read. And when I was a little kid, I would read and walk the dog. You know, I'd be reading, up until very recently, I would read and walk because there were just too many books to read. And I love the idea of showing young people how to, you know, getting young people interested in stories and reading. I love reading aloud. I love being read too, but I also really love reading aloud because I love the ability to watch people respond to the written word, which is made bigger by the way you read it, you know, whereas if you just read in monotone, you know, it's like it's someone will. So it was another, and again, stories, it's all stories. And I do believe like reading fiction really teaches empathy, because you can't empathize, you cannot get into a character if you can't empathize with them. I mean, it's kind of that Atticus Finch line, you have to get inside a person's skin and walk around for a little bit. It's a little bit that. So again, storytelling, you know, and so reading, as an avid reader, I also learned about how you tell a story. At
what point in this process
and along the way,
did you
what's
start
that?
writing? At what point in this process did you start
Yeah, I
writing
was just
your own
about to
stories?
say that. Yeah, I was just going to say, I have written stories on and off since I was probably after the, oh no, because I started writing screenplays when I was interested in film. So that was sort of writing some of them were like TV pilot. I like screenplays because I love dialogue and it's character based, you know, and I love getting inside a character to tell their story. And then I would write little pieces, just like the college essays, you know, I would write little pieces. And I had one published in a local magazine in San Francisco. And because my name is so recognizable, it was a story, it was humorous. but it was a story about my family, and it got back to my father's wife, and she took great issue with it. It hurt her feelings, and she lashed out at me. And I realized, okay, there are limits to what one can publish and not publish in terms of hurting other people's feelings. And I was reckless. I wasn't mindful of the power of the written word and how it can impact somebody else. But I kept writing. You know, I wouldn't publish it, but I would write stories that I was thinking about. Certainly, once Zach was born, I would write stories about him as he was growing up.
Why? Why would you write those stories?
Because I was fascinated by how he was, who he was, and how he was becoming, and that his, like, half the time with Zach, I would look at him and I think, who are your parents? How did you come out like that? How are you this? You know, like, how did that happen? You know, because I admire his backbone. I admire his independent streak. I admire that he really is not someone who's worried about how other people think about him. And as Maya, his partner, always says, he's the one person she knows that's really, truly comfortable in his own skin. And it's true, he is. Does not mean he does not have all kinds of stuff going on, you know, anxiety and all the rest that young people have, but he's not worried about how somebody else will think about him. Not that he has disregard for other people, but that he's not worried. He never was. As a kid, he wasn't worried about did he fit in with the social group or not. He wasn't worried that, I mean, I'm sure there was some of it, of course, all teenagers have that, but it didn't influence how he acted. Was he lonely? Yeah, probably, because but so I would write little stories about him.
Fascination seems like a great reason to write about something. I think that when one is fascinated about something, that comes through, and one is motivated to write, even if there is no necessary reader at the other end of that. How does that value play in your work with students today, if at all?
Oh, sure, of course, because I love the fact that I get to hear what young people are thinking about today. So back to our first discussion about sense of hope and possibility for the future. This is the generation, you know, like getting to know these young people and what they're thinking about and worlds that they're wanting, you know, because for the most part, the kids with whom I work are all socially progressive, politically progressive, have an interest in trying to impact the world in a good way. It'd probably be hard for me to work with someone who didn't, but I'm really fascinated with how they think, what they're thinking about, what matters to them, how they spend their time, not to get the accolades, not to get the awards, but really what matters to them. You know, and maybe it's even some of the anxiety, and maybe some of it's the fears they have. But I like hearing people's stories, and I like hearing stories of people of all ages too. And I really do like hearing what young people are thinking about these days. And then, you know, also because I've, you know, traveled around the sun a lot of times because I'm so old, I can bring perspective to it too. You know, like I'm not their peer. And, you know, I can bring my own stories to the table, not about me, but other stories that might enlighten. And so, and hopefully expand how they see the world or what's possible too. Or make connections in a way that they may not see, you know, that might help them see a different side of themselves. Fascination, I think, is foundational to doing the work we do, you know, being interested. Otherwise, I think that it's mechanical. You know, it's kind of like, okay, and next, you know, as opposed to really caring about these kids, bringing a certain level of care and thoughtfulness to the work, mindfulness to it as well.
You're making me think about the potential healing power of being regarded with fascination as any person, right? As an older person, but as a younger person, especially that's not been the way in which you've been regarded by your primary others or even by your community. You both believe that this work is about much more than just the writing of it. If it were just about the writing of it, it's something that could occur exclusively offline, maybe, or without the cameras on, without meeting the students. and asking so many questions. An artificial intelligence can write your story these days, but the process of coming to your story through another's interest in it is, I think, a really important part of the work.
Well, I think that it's fundamentally human. I think that to be human is to want to be seen and be heard on some level. And I think that writing is a way to be able also to tell your truth. And so it's working with kids to be able to tell their truth, figuring out what that might be, and having an adult that's not their parents help them sort of figure out what that might be is, and someone who is not scary and not a scary adult. I always tell my students, I have a lot of opinions, but I really encourage you to push back and just say, Wendy, you're nuts, or I don't agree. It's like I'm a totally safe person to do that with. And I encourage them to, because I want them also to find their voice. I want them to figure out who are they, right now, what matters to them, what's important to them, what is it? And I love when students are able to identify sort of not just, I want to have a sense of humor here, or I want this, but to be able to figure out how they want to express themselves. And I think that is just a human experience, being able to express oneself and to express oneself, not just in a safe environment, but to feel, for lack of a better word, proud of expressing themselves, and
to
proud
feel
of
a certain
who they are.
sense to your narrative, also to feel like what you've been, what you are, what you feel you are right now makes sense.
And it's valuable, and adds to the human condition and the human dialogue and the human experience, that it has a place alongside everyone else's, that not one or another is more important, but that there is value in it as well. And I think that that's a really important, and I think that's part of the dynamic of working with students, is valuing who they are and listening to them. And it's something I'm also working on, because I tend to be a little talky in my sessions, and learning to rein it in, because I'm very shy and introverted, but not in these little one-on-ones. Starting like rein it in a little, because let them speak, give them more space to speak.
What makes an essay work for you?
Oh, that's a hard one. Typically, it's when you really hear someone, their voice, hearing a voice where something is its own thing. Where it's not, where someone's not afraid to show their foibles, their quirks, the way they think, getting inside, whatever, what doesn't work for me. I can articulate what doesn't work to me is that monotone, or the I did this, isn't this great? Like last year I had a student who had shadowed, wants to be a doctor, had shadowed lots of things, and didn't feel like he needed to do anything other than that was on merit enough of what it was. And I kept saying, but this doesn't tell me anything about you. What did you learn watching that surgeon? What did you learn, pulling out from what that, so for me, it's sort of like what that experience reflects about who they are and how they're thinking about the world in their own way. And seeing a little bit of them come through, and whether it's through language, whether it's through feeling okay, being quirky, whether it's humor, whether it's, certainly we can talk about literary techniques and all that, the craft of writing, but it's more them coming through, and something that is memorable to me, like things that I will remember about, because of the way they put it together, the way they talked about two things that were seemingly disconnected, connected, where they make those unusual connections always, to use the language of CEG, but truly that is lovely when you see someone put together, where it's not the obvious connection always, where it's not like, well, I hurt myself, so I worked hard and then I got back on the field. That feels very, I've heard it a lot, but it's someone who takes something and spins it with their own voice and their own way of seeing it.
I agree 100% that what makes an essay valuable, what I like to listen for, what anyone likes to listen for in writing, is an author's unique voice, that their writing is just a representation of their voice, right? The word is, the word alone on the page is lifeless, but it sort of brings a person and their subjectivity to the reader, which is really hard to do I wonder what some of the tools in your tool belt are for getting that voice on the page. What do you do to help a student make that leap?
That's a really good question. It's hard. What I often do when a student has done preliminary work, brainstorming work, if they've done it, which most of them don't, but when they have, like I have a student right now, he doesn't know what he wants to write about, but it was so clear to me in his brainstorming that he has a marvelous sense of humor. Just funny, like he would argue with the brainstorming thing, like the 21 things you want to college, and he'd say, as he got to 20, he goes, I got 20, that's it. I don't, he had this funny way of responding to it, and I love that because what it said to me is he's not in the box, he's outside the box. He's willing to say, or I had another student, she was a difficult one to work with, but she said that one of the questions in the old CG days was, what's something you've never told anyone else? And her answer was, why would I tell you? I just thought that was hysterical because it's like, why would you? And so what I look for, either in conversation or in the written thing, and I take notes, I should do it online, but I just do it, I'm old school. I look for how they speak. I look for phrases they say. I look for things that, like whether it's humor, whether it's, things that, like things that I see as just specific to that person. In much the same way that like you meet someone in a coffee shop and there's something about the way they talk to you that makes you want to keep having a conversation with them. Whereas there's somebody else and you're like, I'm bored here. I really don't want to hear about their fishing trip or whatever, it's like it's monotone, it's kind of boring. But this one's putting together all kinds of interesting things, and they're like they're talking about, so it's listening to them and seeing what I'm seeing behind the scenes, not the words of I do this, this, and this, because they all tell you that. But it's really what's behind that, whether it's humor, whether it's vulnerability. I had a student who just is having a hardest. I've known him since elementary school. He was one of the students at the school where I was working that was in the learning center. He was a very awkward kid and he still needs some additional help in school and stuff. And there's clearly a lot going on with him, but he starts initially for weeks. There's no story. There's nothing to write about. I know nothing. But then he starts telling me, I started asking him about elementary school. And I said, I remember you walking down that corridor, when you were tall, that head and stuff. And he starts telling me that in elementary school, because he was such an outsider, he would tell lies to get people to like him. And I said, well, let's not say lies. Let's talk about the fish story. So instead of the minnow you caught, it was the swordfish or whatever, think of it in that. I was trying to show him to have more compassion for himself, that there was a little boy in there who wanted just to be liked, just wanted to be included. That's really where but so I look for those kinds of things in somebody. I look for I ask questions. I can feel when someone's in pain. I feel it. It's part of maybe having grown up in a challenging childhood. I know it. I can see it in how someone speaks to me. And I have to be really careful of how I bring it because I'm not a therapist. That's not my skill. It's above my pay grade. But I'm a human and I can respond on a human level to other people. And so that story has stuck with me. Now, whether or not he will write about it, I doubt it. But to me, in my head that night, I'm already writing, here's what I would do with that one, and the ways that I learned compassion for myself, because this was all I was trying to do was to get, I'm writing in his voice, but so I look at the whole person really, and it's one of the reasons why I actually like Zoom better than in person, because Zoom, you feel up close and in person. You don't have the computer between you. When I used to work in person, the computer was always there. The kids could get on the computer, or or we'd be in a cafe and they'd be like watching everybody. Zoom, we're there together, right there, And so I look for the person. Some of it's intuitive, as I say, I'm not a therapist, but I suspect that's a lot of what therapists also do. Is they're looking for the story behind the story. Like people come in to a therapist with a reason, oh, I'm here because I'm going through a divorce. Well, it turns out it's not really about the divorce. It's about this whole host of other things. And that's the lovely journey of going through therapy, is that you realize, oh, yes, it's just the tip of the iceberg there. And I feel like that's a little bit true with kids. Not that it's trouble or anything like that, but there's the tip, the thing they come to the table with is often the tip of like, well, what does that really mean? And, what does that climbing trees mean to you? Or what does that, whatever it is that they've come to the table with, and that is definitely CEG's approach too. It's not, I mean, they never talk about, getting behind the person, but that is definitely they talk about it in a more formal way of values, skills, blah, blah, blah. For me, it's more like getting to know the person. Who is this person? What matters to them, and finding whatever it is and noticing it in a positive way with them, like the kid with the sense of humor. I go, I just love you. I always say, I love your sense of humor. This cracks me up. Or I have learned with, particularly because I've had plenty of them, people who are perfectionists. Finally, when I feel like they trust me, I'll say, I kind of think you're a little bit of a perfectionist. And they like just, I really am, and it's really hard. And then I read the great Annie Lamott quote about perfectionism and how it's the great oppressor and stuff. And they're like, really? Oh, that's so, like they feel relieved both to be seen, but also to realize I will still be this way, but I don't have to hold on to it, And so really it's no different than the way one works with another human being. It really is just finding the kernels of who they are, what matters to them, and then also reflecting back to them the positive things that I'm seeing. And not in any forced way, and not in any, because I know that some of the self-help things nowadays, and, they tend to have a little bit of, they feel pat to me, so I learned just to respond on a human level, as opposed to a line, What I hear you saying is, I don't do that. Sometimes I will, but very rarely. I try to just be me with them, human to human.
I feel like I want to put so many asterisks on what you've said. By asterisks, I mean a big star. Like, yes, like listen to this. This is great.
Oh,
this is
thank you.
important. And instead of doing that, I'll just invoke a line from a meditation I attended exactly a week ago. So 24 times 7. So exactly a week ago, last Friday, near me, where at the end of that meditation, the guide, an old woman with a quavering voice, said, and she said it in Spanish. I'll say it in Spanish because it has a nicer ring to it, and then I'll translate it. El sentido no está en el contenido, está en la presencia. The sense is not in the content, it's in the presence. I want to cite that because of what you said about how it's not about
exactly
the stories being told in the text itself. You could be telling a story about how you would walk around the school telling lies about the fish you caught. And maybe that's where the sense of you, your presence, is that is where the sense of you is. And of course, probably some other story after that one to not make it seem like that's all you've done the rest of your life. But I love what you've shared. I don't want to let you go without asking you about another shared passion, which is swimming. And I would just like to ask you why you love swimming so much.
It's interesting. Someone asked me that recently. And what I realized about swimming is it's meditative. And it is now in my life, it's meditative. It is that 45 minutes every morning, no phone, no podcast, no computer, no nothing. Like people always say, I got to get offline. For me, it's not like, oh, I have to this is getting me offline, but it is that moment where it's quiet, and it's also a place where I do some of, I think, my greatest thoughts, or I think what I think. And, when I'm swimming, I also work out things that are causing anxiety or issues. But I have also always loved swimming because I really love the way it feels, the way my body feels, whether it's in an open water situation. I actually love swimming in open water. I don't do enough of it right now. Because I love the idea of being in the elements. I grew up in the ocean. I loved the ocean. I grew up body surfing. It was, or we didn't have boogie boards back then, but riding rafts and I learned how to body surf and just playing in the ocean. I love water. It's elemental to me. I also love just being by the ocean and being by the water, but on the daily swimming in a pool is more the meditative, because in the ocean, you kind of have to have your heads up. You got to have your wits about you. And even in open water swimming, I have to have my wits, because there's always a seal that will pop up, or, seaweed or something that's going to, it's a different form. That's less meditative for me. That's more sort of like, ooh, this is, exciting. I'm out in this cold bay. But in general, right now, it's really the meditative quality of it for me. It also makes me, like I'm going, my mother's turning 99, and I'm going up for a day and an evening to Portland to see my family, and I'm not going to get to swim for 2 days, and I'm already feeling like this is like, I don't know how I'm going to do this. But what do you love about swimming?
I like about swimming, I also like that I can't listen to music or to my podcasts. I like the first moment when I enter the pool is my favorite,
Mm.
which is when I dunk in, and I like to slide in from the little edge of the pool. I never use the ladders. I like to slide in, and immediately I'll just dunk my whole body in and just swim essentially some breaststrokes. But I like to think of myself as some sort of aquatic animal. Some of that as the longest stretch I can of the pool before coming up for air. That's my favorite part because there's a great silence underwater. It's unlike any other silence. I think you have to go to a cave in Iceland to feel that type of silence otherwise. And even when the pool is full of third graders who have come to swim in the middle of their school day, even then, just dunking underwater, you hear nothing. I love that.
Yeah.
And I like also the way it makes me understand the movements of my body. It's true that every part of you needs to move together in a way underwater. It's also of completely different logic to the one that you use on land. Although I love the way I walk after I swim because I'm encouraged to use all of my body while I walk as well, which is not as obvious maybe in that type of movement. But thank you for asking. I'm so thankful for this chance to put all of the questions I've had for you and about you into one list and into 1 hour together. Thank you so much for what you shared and for the nuggets of wisdom that have come up.
Well, thank you for taking an interest in what I have to say, but thank you for always for our conversations. I always enjoy them. I mean, they are really delightful, and I learned so much from you as well. And I feel very honored to be asked and to have been a part of it. But I really do enjoy our conversations, and I hope they will continue. Not just through the course of our college essay work, but through the course of our travels and journeys. So thank you.
Thanks for being here. If this conversation resonated with you, consider reviewing Therapy for the World or sharing the link with someone who might appreciate it. Until next time, speak with care and listen deeply.